A letter. That was all. Not a man, not a home, not a new life. Just a single piece of paper pinned to an iron gate, and the words on it were cold as Montana steel. I've changed my mind. Do not set foot on my property. Evelyn Harper stood there alone, bag in hand, no money, no return ticket, no one waiting. Abandoned before she ever crossed the threshold. The man who had sent for her couldn't even sign his name. If this happened to you, what would you do? Hit like and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. And subscribe so you never miss what comes next. The letter was not long. That was the part Evelyn could not stop thinking about. Not in the hours after she read it. Not during the long walk back down the road. Not when she finally sat down in the dirt beside her traveling trunk because her legs simply stopped working. The letter was not long. Whoever he was, whatever kind of man spent 3 months exchanging correspondence with a woman, accepted her photograph, sent her train fare, and arranged for her arrival. That man could not even trouble himself to write more than 4 sentences when he changed his mind. I've reconsidered the arrangement. A wife from back east won't suit this land or my needs. Do not attempt entry onto my property. The fare was a business expense I've written off accordingly. No name signed at the bottom. She'd noticed that. As if he'd already erased her. Evelyn folded the letter back into thirds, creased it along the same lines it had arrived in, and placed it carefully into the front pocket of her coat. She didn't know why she kept it. Some stubborn, humiliated part of her needed the evidence, proof that this had really happened, that she hadn't crossed 1,200 miles by train, transferred twice, ridden the last 40 miles on a supply wagon driven by a man who smelled like onions and said nothing to her the entire journey, only to invent this moment out of some elaborate waking nightmare. The gate was iron, heavy and rust-streaked and padlocked, the kind of gate built to keep things out permanently. Beyond it, the road curved through scrub grass and disappeared, and somewhere beyond that curve was a house she would never see, belonging to a man whose face she had never once laid eyes on. She was 27 years old. She had $11.30 in her purse. She had a trunk containing 2 dresses, a winter coat she'd repaired twice, a small mirror with a cracked frame, the letters she'd saved, and a tin of shortbread her neighbor, Mrs. Alderson, had pressed into her hands at the station back in Ohio and said, "Take these, honey, for the journey." The shortbread was gone. She'd eaten the last of it 2 days ago. Evelyn did not cry. She was aware of the pressure behind her eyes, the tightening in her throat, but she pushed both down with a kind of grim mechanical efficiency that she'd been practicing since she was 9 years old and learned that crying accomplished roughly nothing in a house where there was not enough of anything. She pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum, breathed once, and tried to think. She could not go back. That was the first and most important fact. The train ticket had been one way. He'd sent one-way fare, and she hadn't questioned it because she hadn't intended to go back. Going back meant Mrs. Alderson's spare room, which she'd been sleeping in since her father died and the creditors took the house. Going back meant asking for her seamstress position at Hanfield's again, where Mr. Hanfield had already replaced her and made it plain he considered her departure a personal affront. Going back meant Ohio in November, the cold that got into the walls, the particular loneliness of knowing exactly how small your life was going to remain. She had come here to not go back. The problem was that here had turned out to be a padlocked gate and a letter with no signature, and the supply wagon that had brought her was already a memory somewhere down the road behind her. She stood up. Her knees protested. She picked up the smaller of her 2 bags and looked left, then right, along the road that cut between 2 fenced properties. His, which she would never enter, and the neighboring one, which was slightly less tidy and whose fence line had 2 broken posts she could see from where she stood. In the distance to the right, she could make out the dark shape of a barn, smoke rising thin and gray from somewhere behind it. She didn't know who lived there. She didn't know anything about this valley, or this county, or this corner of Montana. She knew she couldn't stand at this gate until dark. She picked up her trunk by the handle on one end and began dragging it along the road. She had made it perhaps 200 yards when she heard the horse. It wasn't galloping. It was moving at the deliberate pace of an animal being asked to go somewhere its rider wasn't entirely sure about. When she turned, She saw a man coming down from the direction of the neighboring property, following the fence line, watching her with an expression she couldn't read at that distance. He was broad-shouldered, dark-coated, with a hat pulled low against the November wind. The horse was a bay with one white sock on the left foreleg. Evelyn stopped walking. She straightened her back, squared her shoulders, and waited, because she had learned early that appearing to wait on your own terms was better than appearing to be caught. He slowed as he got closer, and she could see his face then, mid-30s or past it, with the kind of weathered look that Montana apparently stamped onto people quickly. A jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days. Dark eyes that moved from her face to the trunk she was dragging to the gate behind her and back again. He didn't say anything for a moment. "That's Harding's gate," he said finally. "I'm aware," she said. "You came for the—" He stopped, adjusted something in his expression. "You're the woman he sent for." It wasn't a question. She supposed she wasn't difficult to identify. City coat, traveling trunk, standing in the road in front of a padlocked gate with nowhere obvious to be going. "I was," she said. Apparently that arrangement has been reconsidered. She watched him absorb that. He looked at the gate again, then back at her, and something shifted in his face. Not pity exactly, which she would have found unbearable, but something quieter than that. Recognition, maybe. The look of a man who had encountered enough hard luck to know what it looked like standing in a road. "How long ago did you find out?" he asked. "About 20 minutes." "Where are you headed?" She paused. The honest answer was, "I have absolutely no idea," which she was not prepared to say to a stranger on a Montana road in November. "Town," she said instead, because there had to be a town somewhere, and it was the kind of answer that sounded like she had a plan. "Town's 11 miles east," he said, "on foot with a trunk. I'm aware of how walking works." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "I wasn't doubting that." He was quiet a moment, and the horse shifted its weight, and the wind moved through the fence grass. "I'm Silas Boone. I own the property north of Harding's line." "Evelyn Harper." "Miss Harper." He looked at the trunk again. She could see him calculating something. She wasn't sure what. "I don't suppose you want to hear any kind of proposition from a man you just met." "That depends entirely on the proposition." He pulled in a breath, slow and careful, like he was choosing words with some deliberateness. "I'm not looking for a wife," he said, and she noticed he said it plainly, without apology, which she respected more than she expected to. "I want to be straight about that before I say anything else, because I don't want you to think I'm trying to—" He stopped. "I've got 2 boys, 3 years old, twins. I've been managing the ranch alone since their mother passed 14 months ago, and I can tell you honestly that I'm failing at it. Not the cattle. The cattle are fine. But the house is a wreck, and I've got children who need looking after by someone who isn't me falling asleep in a chair every night." Evelyn said nothing. She was listening. "I'm offering you a room," he said. "Decent wages. $3 a week, plus board and meals. You help me keep the house and look after Owen and Wyatt, you stay as long as you want, and you leave whenever you're ready. No contracts. No obligations beyond the work itself." He paused. "And I'll ride you into town right now if you'd rather. No hard feelings either way, but I thought you ought to know the offer exists." The wind came through again, colder this time, and Evelyn felt it through her coat. She thought about $11.30. She thought about 11 miles east on foot. She thought about the particular reality of a woman alone in an unfamiliar territory in winter, and what towns generally offered that kind of woman, and what kinds of men generally made offers to her, and how this man's offer compared to all of that. $3 a week, she said. $3. And I can leave whenever I choose. No notice required. You can walk out the door any morning you want. She looked at him. Really looked. The way she'd learned to look at people when she needed to decide quickly whether they were lying. He met her eyes without shifting. His horse had gone entirely still. "All right," she said. "Show me where I'll be sleeping." The house was worse than he'd led her to believe, which she suspected he'd known when he made the offer. It wasn't a ruin. The walls stood straight and the roof held, but it had the particular disorder of a space that had been maintained by someone running on too little sleep for too long. Dishes on the wrong shelves, a front room with a coat rack buried under so many layers of outer clothing she couldn't see the wood beneath. The kitchen had a good iron stove and an empty wood box beside it. The windows had curtains, or had at some point. The two in the main room were hanging by a single hook each, trailing at angles. Two small faces appeared around the corner of the hallway doorway the moment she stepped inside. She'd worked with children before. She'd minded her neighbor's 4 kids through 2 summers and helped at the school in Chillicothe one winter when the teacher had the influenza. She knew the look of children who had learned to be quiet, who watched adults carefully because they'd learned that adults sometimes disappeared and it was better to know early when it was happening. These two watched her with identically serious expressions. Brown-eyed, brown-haired, exactly the same in every dimension except one of them had a small scar on his chin and the other didn't. "Owen, Wyatt," Silas said from behind her, and his voice changed when he said their names. It went softer without going quieter. "This is Miss Evelyn. She's going to be staying with us for a while." Neither of them said anything. The one without the scar tucked himself half behind the doorframe. "Hello," Evelyn said. She didn't crouch down or make her voice artificially sweet, which she'd noticed children generally hated. She just said it like she'd say it to anyone. "That's a good hiding spot behind that door. I used to use door frames myself when I was nervous about someone new." The one with the scar looked at her with an expression of careful consideration. "Did it work?" he said. His voice was very small. "Sometimes," she said, "depended on whether the someone new was paying attention." A pause. Then, "I'm Wyatt." "Nice to meet you, Wyatt." The other one edged out from behind the doorframe an inch. "I'm Owen," he said, slightly muffled, as though speaking through his own reluctance. "Owen," she said. "Good name." She straightened and turned to look at the kitchen again, because she'd learned that looking directly at skittish things too long made them retreat. "Mr. Boone," she said, "is there wood for the stove, or do I need to find some?" "I'll get it," he said. "Then I'll start with the dishes," she said, and went to find the wash basin. The first week was not comfortable. She hadn't expected comfortable. She'd expected awkward and provisional and full of the particular tension that arose when strangers tried to inhabit the same space without stepping on each other's private lives, and that was exactly what she got. Silas Boone was a man of few words by nature, and the few he used were generally practical. He told her where things were kept. He explained what the boys could and couldn't eat. Owen would not touch anything with visible onion. Wyatt was prone to nightmares if he ate too close to bedtime. He showed her where the well was and warned her the third step on the porch had a loose board. Beyond that, he left her to it. He was out the door before first light every morning, and most nights he came in after the boys were already in bed, ate whatever she'd left covered on the stove, and disappeared down the hall. She got the impression that this was simply how he lived now, not with any intention of excluding her, just that the shape of his life had contracted around the minimum required to keep it running, and he hadn't thought to expand it. The boys were easier than she'd expected, which surprised her. She'd braced for resistance, for grief expressed as hostility, for the kind of sustained testing that grieving children sometimes performed on new adults to find out exactly where they'd break. Instead, what she got from Owen and Wyatt was a cautious, watchful curiosity that slowly, over several days, became something warmer. Wyatt spoke to her first. He showed up in the kitchen on the third morning while she was making oatmeal and stood at her elbow for a full 2 minutes before saying, without preamble, "Our mama used to sing when she made breakfast." Evelyn didn't look up from the pot. "What kind of songs? The kind with no words? Just humming?" "I can't carry a tune to save my life," she said. "I'm sorry about that." Wyatt considered this. "That's okay," he said at last. "Owen can't either." By the end of the week, both boys had started following her through the house while she worked. Not helping, exactly, but present. Watching. Asking occasional questions in the roundabout way small children did, where the real question was always buried inside the literal one. "What are you making?" meant, "Are you staying for dinner? Is that your coat?" meant, "Are you here tomorrow?" She answered the literal questions and let the real ones rest unanswered, because she didn't think they needed reassurance so much as they needed time. It was on the 9th day that she first heard the name Harding spoken with anything other than neutrality. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the house. The wind was brutal, and she'd already chased a pillowcase across the yard once, when she heard voices from the other side of the fence. She wasn't eavesdropping. The wind carried sound oddly that morning, and the man speaking wasn't making any effort to be quiet. "Your hired woman," a voice said, male and unhurried, with the particular cadence of someone accustomed to being listened to. "You know what people are saying." "I don't particularly care what people are saying." That was Silas. "You should. This valley has a long memory boon. A man keeps a single woman in his house, wages or no wages. People are going to talk. And when they talk, it affects your credit at the trading post, your standing with the cattlemen's group, your— Is there something you wanted, Harding? Or did you ride over here to educate me on community opinion?" A pause. Then the other voice again, smoother now. "She came for me. Whatever story she's told you." "I know she did." "Then you know she's not your business to take in. She's an embarrassment to herself and frankly to the situation." Evelyn's hands had gone still on the sheet she was pinning. She was aware of her own heartbeat. "An embarrassment," Silas said. "You know what I mean." "I'd like you to say plainly what you mean." Another pause, longer this time. When the voice came back, it had lost some of its smoothness. "I'm telling you as a neighbor, Boone, you've got boys to consider, a reputation. Having her there is going to cause you problems you don't need." "I'll worry about my problems," Silas said. "You worry about yours." The silence that followed had an ending in it. She heard hoofbeats, one set, moving away. She went back to pinning the sheet. Her hands were not entirely steady. She had known who the neighbor was, of course. She wasn't surprised that he was the kind of man who would call her an embarrassment while also having abandoned her at his own gate. She wasn't surprised that he'd come to make it Silas's problem instead of facing it. What surprised her, what she was not sure she'd accounted for, was how immediately and entirely Silas had dismissed him. Not with a speech or a declaration, just, "I'll worry about my problems." She stood at the laundry line in the November wind and thought about what that meant, and was annoyed to find her eyes were blurring slightly. She blinked it away, put the last pin in, picked up the empty basket, and went back inside. The third week brought cold that was different in kind from anything she'd experienced in Ohio. Ohio cold was damp and gray and got into your bones through attrition. Montana cold in November was clear and absolute, as though the temperature had simply decided what it was going to be and the world could arrange itself accordingly. The first hard frost took out the last of the kitchen garden. There wasn't much left anyway, but Evelyn stood at the window and looked at the blackened remains of the herb row and felt the loss of it more than she expected. She started keeping a mental list of what the house needed. Not as a way of entrenching herself, she was careful about that, careful not to think of anything here as permanent, but because she was constitutionally unable to live in a space and watch it fall apart without doing something about it. The curtains needed rehinging, the front room needed the accumulated coats sorted, and the rack actually fastened to the wall properly, since it was listing at an angle that was eventually going to bring the whole thing down. The boys' room had a gap under the door that let in cold all night. She found rags in the mending basket and stuffed them along the bottom. Silas noticed. She could tell by the way he sometimes stopped in a doorway and looked at whatever she'd fixed with an expression she couldn't entirely categorize. He didn't say much, but one evening he came in to find her reinforcing the shelf brackets in the kitchen that had been pulling out of the wall, and he stood there for a long moment and then said, "You don't have to do all that." "I know," she said. She drove the nail home with 2 clean strikes. "I'm doing it because it needed doing." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said finally. In his mouth, the words had the slightly awkward quality of something he didn't use often enough. "You're welcome," she said. He stood there another moment, like he wanted to say something else and hadn't decided whether to, and then he went down the hall. The moment that changed things, the first one, the one she would think about later, happened because of a cup of coffee. It was late November, a Friday, and she'd come downstairs earlier than usual because she couldn't sleep. She'd made coffee and was sitting at the kitchen table with it when Silas came in the back door stamping mud off his boots. He stopped when he saw her. She got up to pour him a cup without being asked and set it on the table and sat back down. He sat across from her. He wrapped both hands around the cup. Outside, the wind had picked up, and they could hear it moving along the eaves. "What woke you?" he said. "Couldn't settle," she said. "You." "Lost a calf last night. Found her this morning." He looked at the table. "She was the first one born this year, February." "I'm sorry," she said. He shrugged, the way people did when they were trying to make something smaller than it was. "It happens." "That doesn't make it not a loss," she said. He looked at her then. Really looked, the way he hadn't quite done in the 3 weeks she'd been here. And she met it, because she'd stopped flinching away from being looked at around about the same time she stopped waiting to be told she could stay. "No," he said, "it doesn't." They sat there in the kitchen with their coffee and the wind outside, and the particular quality of quiet that two people make when they've stopped pretending they don't know the other person is there. Later, she would identify that Friday morning as the moment the provisional became something else. Not love. She wasn't ready to name it that, and she suspected he wasn't either. But something. The acknowledgement that there were two people living in this house, both of them carrying things, and that the weight of one might reasonably be witnessed by the other. She would think that was when we stopped being strangers. She would also think it was a very long time before either of us knew what to do with that. What no one in the valley told her in those first weeks was how much they were watching. She learned it later, piecemeal, from the woman at the dry goods store who finally introduced herself in December and said, with the directness Evelyn was learning to associate with the women of this particular county, "We heard about what Harding did. Just so you know, there's not a person on this road who thinks well of him for it." She learned it from the pastor's wife, who stopped her after the Sunday service she'd attended with the boys and pressed her hand and said nothing but held it long enough to mean something. She learned it from the way men tipped their hats differently to Silas now when they spoke in town, with a slight additional weight to it, an extra measure of respect that she suspected had something to do with the fact that he'd brought her in and kept her on. She hadn't expected to matter to this community. She'd come here for a gate and a locked house and a man who didn't want her, and instead she'd ended up at the center of something she couldn't quite name. A story the valley was telling itself about what kind of place it was and what kind of people lived in it. Harding, she understood, was on the wrong side of that story. She understood it completely the morning she came downstairs to find Owen and Wyatt sitting on the kitchen floor, each of them holding one end of a piece of string, engaged in some complicated game that involved the string going over and under their fingers in patterns she couldn't follow. They were talking to each other in the low, unhurried way twins sometimes did, the shorthand of people who had known each other their entire lives, and they didn't look up when she came in. But Wyatt said, without looking up from the string, "Miss Evelyn, Owen wants oatmeal, but I want eggs." "Tell Owen that wanting and getting are two different things," she said, going to the stove. Owen looked up with an expression of exquisite 3-year-old betrayal. "That's not fair." "Life rarely is," she said. "You're getting oatmeal." But she was smiling when she said it, her back to them, and it was a real smile, not the careful kind she'd been deploying in public. She was still smiling when Silas came in 10 minutes later and stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene, the boys on the floor, the oatmeal on the stove, Evelyn at the counter slicing bread, and said nothing, just moved to the hook for his coat with an expression she didn't catch. She would wonder later what he'd seen in that moment, what the room had looked like from the doorway. She suspected she knew. She suspected it looked like something he'd stopped expecting to see. The smile she'd hidden that morning in the kitchen stayed with Evelyn longer than she expected. Not as warmth exactly, but as a kind of unsettling evidence. Evidence that she had stopped performing contentment and started feeling something close to the actual thing, which frightened her more than the alternative had. She told herself it was just the relief of useful work. She told herself that any person with a functioning heart would soften toward 2 3-year-old boys who referred to each other by name in their sleep, which she'd overheard one night passing their door. She told herself that Silas Boone's particular brand of quiet decency was simply what a decent man looked like, and she'd spent enough time around the other kind that she'd lost her calibration. She told herself all of it, and mostly believed it, and kept moving. December arrived with a force that made November look like an apology. The temperature dropped in a single night and stayed dropped, and Evelyn learned things about Montana winter that no one had seen fit to mention in the correspondence she'd exchanged. That the cold had a sound to it, a tightening in the wood of the house that woke her some nights like a rifle crack, that the boys needed their boots warmed by the stove before they could be put on without tears, that Silas came in from the morning chores with ice in his beard and said nothing about it, just stood by the stove and thawed by degrees while she handed him coffee. She learned to have the coffee ready. She wasn't sure when she'd started doing that, anticipating the time he came in, making sure the pot was fresh. It wasn't something she'd decided. It had simply become part of the rhythm of the morning, the way certain habits accumulated without announcement. Wyatt noticed before she did. He was standing at the window one morning, watching his father cross the yard, and said without turning around, "You always make more coffee when Papa comes in." "Coffee's better hot," she said. Wyatt turned and looked at her with the particular expression he had, the one that was too old for his face, that made her think sometimes his mother must have had the same eyes. "Mama used to do that too," he said. Evelyn didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at the pot in her hand. "She sounds like she was a smart woman," she said. Wyatt turned back to the window. "She was," he said very seriously. "Owen says he doesn't remember her voice anymore, but I do." He paused. "I think." She set the pot down carefully and went to stand beside him at the window. They watched Silas close the barn door against the wind, his movements efficient and slightly stiff from the cold. "That's worth holding on to," she said, "whatever part of it you've still got." Wyatt didn't answer, but he leaned, almost imperceptibly, against her arm. She stood very still and let him. Boom. The trouble with Harding didn't announce itself. It arrived sideways, the way the worst things did. She first noticed it at the trading post in mid-December, when she'd taken the wagon in with Owen and Wyatt to pick up flour and salt and a length of wool flannel she wanted for mending. Caldwell, who ran the post, had always been straightforward with her. Polite, efficient, the kind of merchant who prided himself on minding his own business. But that morning he was slower than usual, and twice he disappeared into the back room for stretches of time that didn't seem to match what he was retrieving, and when he finally set her order on the counter, he said, with his eyes on the ledger, "You're putting this on Boone's account?" "Yes," she said. "Same as always." He wrote it down, didn't look up. It was a small sound, the kind a man made when he was deciding not to say something. "Is there a problem with the account?" she asked. "No problem," he said, in the tone of a man for whom there was, in fact, a problem. She paid for what she could in cash, the flour and salt, and put the flannel back. She drove home with the boys in the wagon bed, asking why they hadn't gotten peppermint sticks the way they usually did, and she told them that sometimes things cost more than they should, which was not an answer, but was true. That evening, she waited until the boys were in bed and found Silas in the front room sharpening a blade by lamplight. "Something's changed at Caldwell's," she said. "He didn't look up from the blade." "I know." "How long?" "Couple weeks. He ran the edge along the stone. Harding does a lot of business with him, more than I do." "Is it affecting your credit?" "Starting to." He set the stone down and looked at her then. "It's nothing I can't manage." "That's not what I asked." A pause. The lamp guttered and steadied. "No," he said. "It's not nothing." She sat down across from him. "He's doing this because of me." "He's doing this because he's a man who doesn't like losing an argument," Silas said. "The argument happened to be about you." "That's a polite way to say what it is." He was quiet for a moment. "I knew he'd push back on something. I didn't expect it to be the credit. Usually, men like Harding go for the water." He paused. "He controls the upstream on the East Irrigation Channel. If he decides to be unneighborly about it in the spring, we'll have a harder problem." She sat with that for a moment. The fire in the grate had burned down to coals, and the room was cooling. "I can find work in town," she said. "If it would help. Extra wages." "That's not the solution?" He picked up the blade again, then set it back down. "Evelyn, this isn't your fault. I know whose fault it is." "Then stop calculating ways to compensate for it. That's his leverage, making you feel like your presence here is the problem." He looked at her directly. "Your presence here is not the problem." She held his gaze for a beat longer than was strictly necessary, then looked at the fire. "What is the solution, then?" she said. "Not certain yet," he said, "but I'm working on it." It wasn't reassuring, exactly, but it was honest, and she'd come to value his honesty more than his reassurances, which he rarely offered anyway. She went to bed and lay awake for an hour, thinking about water rights and credit lines and the particular mechanics of how a man like Harding operated. Not with fists, not with anything that left marks, but with the slow application of economic pressure until the thing he wanted to collapse simply collapsed under its own exhaustion. She thought, he is counting on us running out of endurance before he runs out of patience. She thought, he has not met me. January brought something she hadn't anticipated, which was the way the valley contracted in winter. Not just in temperature, but in human geography. The ranches that had seemed isolated in November became genuinely remote once the roads iced. Visits that had been brief became extended by necessity when a storm rolled in, and strangers who shared a fire for a night emerged knowing each other in the particular shorthand way that shelter forced. She met more of the valley's people in January than she had in the 2 months prior. The Lundqvists from the North End, who had 6 children and a cow named Harriet, who was also, apparently, something of a local celebrity. The widow Cora Petty, who was 73 and had survived 3 husbands and a prairie fire and had opinions on all of it. The 2 Beaumont brothers from up the mountain, who were taciturn and enormous and turned out to be extraordinarily gentle with Owen and Wyatt in the way that very large people sometimes were with small ones. She built relationships quietly, the way she did most things, not with declarations of friendship, but with the accumulation of small, reliable acts. She helped Mrs. Lundqvist with a difficult birth in February. Not the woman's birth, but their cows, which had gone wrong in the night and required 2 sets of hands and a level of stubbornness Evelyn hadn't known she possessed. She spent 3 hours in a freezing barn and got the calf out and didn't mention it to anyone, but Mrs. Lundqvist told everyone, and after that the valley looked at Evelyn Harper slightly differently. Cora Petty, who looked at everyone slightly differently as a matter of principle, sought her out specifically after hearing about the calf. "I heard you spent a night in the Lundqvist barn," she said, settling into the chair at Evelyn's kitchen table as though she'd been sitting there for years. "A few hours," Evelyn said. "A few hours in a January barn at 2 a.m, Cora said. "I'm reassessing you upward." "You'd assessed me already?" "I assess everyone." She accepted the coffee Evelyn set in front of her and wrapped both hands around it in a way that reminded Evelyn, sharply, unexpectedly, of Silas at the stove. "People were curious about you when you arrived. A woman alone, taken in by a widower. The usual questions." "I assumed," Evelyn said. "What you might not have assumed is that most of us landed on the right side of the answer pretty quick." Cora looked at her over the rim of the cup. "Boone's a good man. He was a wreck after Clara died. Those boys were—" She stopped. "Well, you've seen them. They're better now. That's not coincidence." Evelyn said nothing because she didn't know what to say to that. "Harding's running his mouth," Cora said, changing direction without warning. "In case you didn't know." "I'd gathered. He's been telling people you came here chasing Silas after he rejected you, that the mail-order business was a misunderstanding and you're making it out to be more than it was." She said it flatly, without embellishment, because she seemed to be the kind of woman who believed in delivering bad news clean. "I want you to know that the people saying it are all people who owe Harding something. The rest of us know what a locked gate looks like." Evelyn's jaw had tightened while Cora spoke. She made herself relax it. "Thank you for telling me directly." "I don't see the point in the other way." Cora drank her coffee. "You planning to do anything about it?" "I'm thinking about it." "Good." Cora set the cup down. "Think fast. Spring's coming, and he'll move on the water if he hasn't already made his point with the gossip." She pushed back her chair with the unhurried certainty of a woman who went everywhere on her own schedule. "Bring those boys to see me sometime. I haven't had children in my house in years, and I find I miss the noise." She left, and Evelyn stood at the window watching her wagon until it crested the ridge and disappeared, and thought about what thinking fast meant when you were a woman in a valley where a man controlled the water. Well, she was thinking about it still 3 days later when the river gave her something else entirely to think about. March came early and angry that year. The snowpack in the mountains had been heavy. The kind of accumulation that old-timers described by referencing the last time it was that bad, which was always at least 20 years ago, and always ended with a flood story. Evelyn had heard 2 of those stories in January and filed them under things people say about weather without giving them particular weight. She gave them weight in March. The Callaway Creek, which ran along the eastern edge of the valley and was normally a modest, well-behaved waterway that the boys occasionally threw sticks into, began rising on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, it was over its banks in 3 places. By Thursday evening, Silas had moved the cattle to the high pasture and was working with the Beaumont brothers to reinforce the lower fence line, and Evelyn had the boys inside and was watching the water creep across the east field with a feeling in her chest that was very specific and very cold. She heard the shouting from the Callaway place before she saw anything. The Callaways were half a mile east, a family she'd met only twice, young, 3 children under 5, their house sitting in the low ground near the creek bend. That was, she now understood, exactly the wrong place for a house in a year like this one. She heard a woman's voice first, high and carrying over the wind, and then a man's voice answering, and then a sound she couldn't identify that turned out, when she got outside and looked, to be their roof-taking water. She told Owen and Wyatt to stay inside and put on their boots anyway, because she knew they wouldn't. She went. The road between the properties was already ankle-deep in places, the water brown and moving fast, carrying sticks and debris, and one very confused-looking chicken that Evelyn stepped around without stopping. She could see the Callaway house clearly now. The creek had jumped its bank on the eastern side and was pushing directly against the back wall of the structure. Margaret Callaway was on the front porch with all 3 children, the youngest one in her arms screaming for her husband, who was inside trying to get something. She couldn't see what, couldn't hear the answer. And the water around the porch steps was at the second one and rising. Evelyn didn't stop to calculate. She went through the water to the porch and got Margaret's arm and said as clearly as she could over the noise, "You need to move right now. Take the children and go toward the ridge. Do not go back." Margaret looked at her with wild eyes. "Daniel's inside?" "I'll get Daniel. You get the children to the ridge." She held the woman's gaze until she saw the wildness settle into something closer to comprehension. "Go. Now." Margaret went. All 3 children went with her, the oldest one holding the middle one's hand with impressive resolution for someone who was 4 years old. Evelyn went into the house. It was worse inside. The back wall had a crack running floor to ceiling that hadn't been there before. She could see daylight and water through it, which meant the foundation was going. Daniel Callaway was in the back room trying to move a chest, massive and wooden, toward the door. "Leave it," she said. He looked at her, confused, soaked, his face white. "Our papers are in it. The deed. Everything. Where are the papers exactly?" "Top drawer?" She crossed the room, opened the top drawer, grabbed the stack of documents inside. It wasn't much. She could hold it all in one hand, and pulled him by the arm toward the door. Behind them, she heard the back wall make a sound that she felt more than heard, a deep groaning protest of wet wood under pressure. They were out the door and off the porch before the back corner of the house came in. She didn't stop moving until they were up the slope, both of them gasping, the papers still in her hand. She stood in the mud on the high ground and watched water push through the Callaway house like it had always meant to be there, and felt her legs shaking. Not from exertion exactly, but from the particular aftermath of having made very quick decisions and having them work. Daniel Callaway sat down in the mud and put his face in his hands. She gave him a moment. Then she said, "Your family's up there," and pointed toward the ridge where she could see Margaret and the children. He got up and went. She stood there alone for a moment, the documents in her hand getting damp at the edges, and looked at the ruined house and thought, everything they built is in there. And then she thought with a clarity that surprised her, but everyone is out. When she turned around, Silas was there. She didn't know when he'd arrived. He was standing 10 feet away, soaked through, and he was looking at her with an expression she had no framework for. "The Beaumont boys told me," he said. "I came as fast as I could." "Everyone's out," she said. "The house is gone. The deed and the paperwork are—" She held up the damp documents. "Mostly intact." He stood there looking at her for another moment. Then he closed the distance between them and took the papers from her hand and tucked them inside his coat, and she understood it was to keep them dry, not for any other reason, but her hand felt oddly empty after. "You went in," he said. "Someone needed to." You went in alone. You weren't available. She looked at him directly. I made a judgment call. The back wall was already failing. There wasn't time to wait. He exhaled. It wasn't quite anger. It was something more complicated, the expression of a man who understood exactly what could have happened and was standing next to the evidence that it hadn't. Next time, he said carefully, you tell me. Next time you're there to tell, she said. It wasn't an apology and it wasn't a promise, and they both knew it. He looked at her for another long moment, and then looked away, up toward the ridge where the Calloways were gathered. Come on, he said. Let's get them somewhere dry. She followed him up the slope, her boots heavy with mud, and she was aware, with an acuity that felt new, of him walking beside her, close enough that their arms nearly touched, both of them wet through, and the particular quality of moving through something difficult alongside a person who didn't require explanation. She thought, this is what it is then. This specific thing, not love or romance or any of the words she'd read in the books she'd grown up with. This, walking up a muddy hill after something terrible, not needing to explain yourself. She didn't know what to call it yet. She just kept walking. The valley talked about what she'd done for weeks. She found this uncomfortable in a way she couldn't quite articulate. Not because she wanted to be invisible, but because the version of the story the valley told was slightly cleaner than the truth of it. In the valley's version, she was calm and decisive and fearless. In her own memory, she was also terrified, and her hands had not stopped shaking for 20 minutes after, and she'd gone behind the barn when they got home and sat on a crate in the cold and breathed until her chest stopped feeling like a fist. But she didn't say that to anyone. She said, I just did what needed doing until people stopped asking, which they eventually did. What they didn't stop doing was looking at her differently, not as the woman Harding had thrown away, not as the stranger Boone had taken in out of some practical necessity, something more settled than either of those things, as though the flood had sorted her into a different category in their accounting. Harding noticed. She could tell by the way his campaign shifted. He stopped talking about her character and started talking about her influence. She heard, through Cora, that he told people at the cattlemen's meeting that Silas Boone was letting a woman with no stake in the valley make decisions that affected everyone, and that it was a fine thing to be charitable, but there was such a thing as letting charity undermine good sense. It might have worked 6 months ago. It might have worked if she'd been the woman who arrived at the gate in November, uncertain, stripped of everything, defined entirely by what had been done to her. She wasn't that woman anymore. She wasn't sure she'd ever been only that woman, but she was definitely not her now. She thought about what Cora had said. Think fast, spring's coming, he'll move on the water. And she thought about the papers she'd carried out of the Calloway house. And she thought about Daniel Calloway's face when he said the deed, everything, and something that had been forming at the back of her mind for weeks began to come forward into something she could actually see. She waited until a Sunday evening in late March, when the boys were in bed and the house was quiet, and Silas was at the kitchen table with his account ledger. She sat down across from him. I want to talk to you about Harding, she said. He looked up from the ledger. He closed it. I'm listening, he said. She set her hands flat on the table. He's going to move on the water in the spring. You said it yourself. And I don't think you can stop him alone. I don't think any one ranch in this valley can stop him alone. She watched his face. But 6 ranches together have different legal standing than one, and 6 property deeds registered jointly in their water rights have more weight in a county court than one man with one claim. Silence. You want to organize the ranchers, he said. I want to make it impossible for one man to control a resource that belongs to all of them, she said. Harding's leverage exists because everyone is fighting him separately. If they're not separate, he doesn't have leverage. He has 6 plaintiffs and no case. Silas looked at her for a long moment. That's not a small thing to arrange. I know. People in this valley have a strong preference for keeping their business their own. They also have a strong preference for water in their fields in July, she said. I think I know which one they'll prioritize. He was quiet for another beat. Then he said, You'd have to be the one to talk to them. I can't do it. They'll see it as me trying to consolidate power. It has to come from someone who doesn't have a stake in who leads. I know that too, she said. Evelyn, his voice was different. You understand what you're stepping into. If this works, Harding's finished in this valley. If it doesn't, I'm already the woman he abandoned at his own gate, she said. My standing with him is not something I'm protecting. He looked at her. That same look from the hillside, the one she still didn't have a full name for. All right, he said. All right? Make the case. I'll back whatever you build. It wasn't a vote of confidence delivered with flourish. It was just a man at a kitchen table saying, I trust what you're doing, and meaning it without decoration. She thought it was possibly the most useful thing anyone had ever said to her. I'll start with Cora Petty, she said. She'll tell you everything you need to know about everyone else, he said, and turned back to his ledger. She sat there a moment longer, the lamp between them, the house quiet around them, and thought, this is not what I came to Montana for. Then she thought, no. But it might be exactly what I came for after all. Cora Petty said yes before Evelyn finished asking. That was how it started. Not with a dramatic rallying of the valley, not with speeches or declarations, but with a 73-year-old widow sitting in her kitchen saying, I've been waiting for someone to suggest this for 11 years, and then immediately producing a list of names she'd apparently been keeping in her head for that same 11 years, organized by reliability, temperament, and what she described as their tolerance for Harding's particular brand of nonsense. The list had 14 names on it. Evelyn borrowed a pencil and wrote them all down. The first conversations were harder than she'd expected, which was saying something because she hadn't expected any of them to be easy. The ranchers of the Callaway Valley were, as Silas had warned, people with a strong preference for managing their own affairs, which was a polite way of saying they had spent years developing elaborate rationales for why cooperation with their neighbors was either unnecessary or dangerous or both. She sat in 6 different kitchens over 3 weeks in April and made the same case 6 different ways, because each family had a different version of the problem and a different version of what they were most afraid of. The Lundqvists were afraid of losing the East Field if Harding diverted the channel in July. She talked to them about that specifically, about what the county water rights registration process looked like, about how a jointly filed claim would sit in court, about what that meant for their July. Eric Lundqvist listened with his arms crossed for 40 minutes and then asked 3 questions that were all essentially the same question phrased differently, and when she'd answered all 3, he uncrossed his arms and said, My wife thinks we should do it. I think we should do it. We'll sign whatever needs signing. The Beaumont brothers were less verbal about their concerns, but more direct about their bottom line. The older one, Thomas, listened to her for 10 minutes and then said, If Harding cuts the water, how long before we're selling cattle at a loss? She told him. He looked at his brother. His brother shrugged, which seemed to function as agreement. Fine, Thomas said. What do you need from us? The harder conversations were with the families who had existing arrangements with Harding, small debts, a shared fence line, a grazing agreement that benefited them. She didn't pretend those things didn't exist. She sat across from each of them and said plainly, Here is what he's offering you, and here is what it will cost you in 5 years when he decides the arrangement no longer serves him. She said it without anger, because anger would have made them defensive, and defensive people didn't sign documents. 3 of them took 2 visits each. By the end of April, she had 11 signatures on a petition she'd drafted herself, working from a legal form she'd borrowed from the county clerk's office in town, who had been a young woman named Agnes Burr, sharp-faced, efficient, apparently deeply curious about what Evelyn was doing, though she'd confined her curiosity to 3 precise questions rather than the wider interrogation her expression suggested she wanted to conduct. She brought the petition home on a Thursday evening and set it on the kitchen table in front of Silas without saying anything. He looked at it, turned it over, counted the signatures. 11, he said. 11, she said. Cora says there are 2 more she can get by the end of the month. That's 13 properties with joint water rights claims. Harding's got 2 of his own and partial agreements on 2 others. He can't outnumber a coalition of 13 in county court. Silas set the petition down carefully. He looked at her with that expression she'd stopped trying to name, because every name she came up with felt like it was reaching for something she wasn't ready to hold. How long did this take you? He said. Since March. You were doing this since March. I had a conversation in March, she said. The rest of it took time. He was quiet for a moment, Then, I didn't realize you were already moving. You said back whatever I built, she said. I was building. He sat back in his chair with a long exhale, and she wasn't sure if it was relief or something else. We need to file before July, he said, before he can make the first diversion and establish precedent. Agnes at the clerk's office said mid-June is the deadline for the current filing cycle, she said. We have 6 weeks. 6 weeks. He looked at the petition again. What do you need from me for the filing? Your signature, your property deed, and approximately 4 hours in town with a county notary, she said, and possibly someone to watch the boys. Cora will watch them, he said. She already offered. He looked up at her sharply. You asked her before you asked me. I asked her on Tuesday, she said. I was going to ask you tonight. He held her gaze for a moment that was not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable, but something more interesting than either. Then he made a short sound that was almost a laugh. Not amused exactly, but genuine. All right, he said. Tuesday it is. What she hadn't anticipated was what Harding would do when he heard about it. She should have anticipated it. She'd been watching how he operated for 6 months. The slow economic pressure, the gossip, the management of other people's debts as a form of leverage. She knew the pattern. What she hadn't fully calculated was how quickly the pattern would escalate when the ordinary tools stopped working. She heard about the incident with the Lundqvists first, from Mrs. Lundqvist herself, who came to the door on a Saturday morning in early May with a look on her face that Evelyn had not seen there before, a look that was past anger and sitting somewhere colder. He came to see Eric last night, she said before Evelyn had even fully opened the door. Harding, he came to our house. Evelyn stood back to let her in. What did he say? He told Eric that if we filed on the water rights, he'd call in a debt Eric's father owed him 15 years ago, a grazing debt from before we were married. She sat down without being invited to, which was a measure of how she felt. He has a paper on it. I don't know if it's real or not, but he has a paper. Evelyn sat down across from her. How much is the debt? He said $80. She paused. Which might as well be $800 this time of year. Evelyn thought for a moment. Is the debt in Eric's name or his father's? His father's. His father is dead. Does Eric have documentation of inheritance? A will, a deed transfer, anything that establishes the estate's debts were settled? Mrs. Lundqvist looked at her. I don't know. We'd have to look. Look, Evelyn said. If there's no clear inheritance of the debt, Harding may not have legal standing to call it in against Eric personally. He's banking on Eric not knowing that. A silence. Then Mrs. Lundqvist said quietly, he also said, she stopped. Tell me. He said that you were the one pushing this, that you'd talked Eric into something he didn't understand, and that you had your own reasons for wanting to cause trouble in this valley. She looked at Evelyn directly. He didn't say what reasons. He left it at that. Evelyn held very still for a moment. What did Eric say to that? She said. He said Harding could get off his property. Mrs. Lundqvist let out a long breath. He also said some other things I won't repeat in polite company. Something in Evelyn's chest loosened. Just slightly, just enough. Good, she said. But we need to know about the debt, she said. I'll find out what I can about inheritance law and contested debts, Evelyn said. Agnes Burr at the clerk's office can tell us where to look. Bring me whatever documents you have from Eric's father's estate, and I'll go through them. She said it with more confidence than she felt, because she was not a lawyer and had no formal training in any of this. What she had was a facility for reading documents, a stubbornness that had been with her since childhood, and the particular focus that came from being angry enough to think clearly instead of just being angry. She went to see Agnes Burr on Monday. Agnes was, as it turned out, exactly as interested in the situation as her expression had implied the first time. She pulled 3 different county filing ledgers before Evelyn finished explaining what she needed, and then sat with her for 2 hours going through inheritance statutes while her assistant handled the counter. You know what you're doing is going to make an enemy, Agnes said at one point without looking up from the ledger. He was already an enemy, Evelyn said. I'm just clarifying the terms. Agnes looked up then and studied her for a moment. I like you, she said, in the tone of someone registering a fact. Then she went back to the ledger. What Agnes found, and what Evelyn carried back to the Lundqvists 3 days later, was that under current county statute, a debt owed by a deceased party was dischargeable against the estate, not the heirs, unless the heirs had explicitly assumed it in writing at the time of inheritance. Eric Lundqvist had never signed any assumption of his father's debts. If Harding wanted to pursue the claim, he'd be pursuing it against a closed estate with no assets, and he almost certainly knew that. He'd been bluffing. She sat with Eric at his kitchen table and explained it in plain terms, and watched the specific transformation of a man who had been afraid releasing into a man who was something more useful than afraid. He knew the whole time it was nothing, Eric said. He knew the whole time, she said. He was counting on you not knowing. Eric was quiet for a moment, then he said, "What else is he bluffing about?" It was exactly the right question. She didn't tell Silas all of it, not all at once, partly because the pieces kept arriving. A new development every few days, a new piece of pressure from Harding on someone else in the coalition, and partly because she was still in the habit, old and hard, of solving her own problems before reporting them. It was a habit she'd developed in Ohio, where reporting a problem had usually meant hearing either that it wasn't actually a problem, or that she should have prevented it, and neither was useful. Silas noticed. He didn't say anything about it directly, which was consistent with how he operated. He didn't demand explanations or assert his right to information, but she began to catch him watching her in the evenings, when she was at the kitchen table with papers spread around her, and she could feel the question he wasn't asking, which was, "What is the full shape of this? And are you carrying more than you should be?" She answered the unasked question on a May evening when the boys were in bed, and a spring thunderstorm had settled in over the valley, and the rain on the roof was loud enough to cover conversation from anywhere in the house. She told him about the Lundqvist debt. She told him about the two families on the South End who'd received similar visits from Harding, with similar implied threats. She told him about the conversation she'd had that week with Daniel Calloway, whose house was still not rebuilt, who was living with relatives and trying to figure out how to manage on what the flood had left him, and how Harding had approached him with an offer to buy the land at a price that was just generous enough to look like charity and just low enough to be an insult to anyone who knew what the land was worth. She told him she'd talked Daniel out of taking the offer, which she felt somewhat guilty about because she wasn't sure she'd given him a clear picture of all the risks. Silas listened through all of it without interrupting, which she'd come to recognize as the way he listened when something mattered. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The rain moved in a sheet across the roof. "You should have told me about the Lundqvist visit when it happened," he said. "I know. Not because I could have fixed it, but because I could have—" He stopped, and she saw him choosing the word carefully. "Been useful. Somehow." "I'm not used to that," she said, "having someone to tell." He looked at her then with an expression that was not pity. She was clear on that, had become very good at the distinction, but something quieter, something that acknowledged what she'd said without turning it into an occasion. "I know," he said. "I'm not either." That sat between them for a moment, above the sound of the rain. "Calloway's land is the piece Harding needs most," Silas said, shifting back to the practical. "The creek runs through it. If he gets that parcel, he controls the primary intake for the whole East Channel. Which is why he offered today and not 6 months from now," she said. "What did you tell Calloway about the alternative?" "I told him there might be a better offer if he waited," she said. "I told him I couldn't promise it." "We could hold a mortgage on it," Silas said, "between the coalition members. Keep it out of Harding's hands until Calloway can rebuild." She looked at him. "You'd do that." "It's not charity. It's a legal instrument. Calloway keeps the title, we hold the note. Harding can't buy what's already encumbered." He paused. "It's what you were thinking. I can see it." "I was thinking something like it," she admitted. "I wasn't sure you'd want to involve the ranch's money." "It's not only my money anymore," he said. And then he seemed to hear what he'd said, and something in his face went briefly and visibly uncertain. "The coalition money. From the joint filing." "Yes," she said carefully. "That's what I understood." She did not press the moment. He didn't either. The rain filled the silence between them, and she was grateful for it. Oh. June arrived with the kind of clarity that Montana produced after a wet spring. The grass in the high pasture went a green so saturated it almost looked wrong, and the sky ran blue from edge to edge without interruption, and Owen and Wyatt became essentially feral in their enthusiasm for the outdoors, requiring supervision that Evelyn coordinated with the loose, practiced efficiency of someone who had long since stopped thinking of it as a task. She noticed that she'd stopped thinking of it as a task without being sure when that had happened. The boys had been spending part of their mornings with her at the kitchen table, not formally, not with any declared intention of education, but because Owen had shown an interest in the paper she was always working through, and Wyatt had shown an interest in whatever Owen was doing. She'd started explaining things to them, simply, the way she explained things to herself. Here's the problem. Here's what I know about it. Here's what I need to find out. They absorbed it in the loose, lateral way children absorbed things and produced unexpected questions. Wyatt, one morning in early June, "Why does Mr. Harding want everybody's water?" "Because whoever controls the water controls what grows," she said. "And whoever controls what grows has power over everyone who needs to grow things to survive." Wyatt thought about this. "That's mean," he said. "It is," she said. "Papa should punch him," Owen said from across the table with serene confidence. "Papa would prefer to defeat him in county court," she said. Owen considered this. "Is that better than punching?" "Much better," she said. "It lasts longer." She told Silas about it that evening, and he didn't laugh. He rarely laughed outright, but the corner of his mouth moved in a way that she'd come to recognize as the equivalent, in his particular economy, of an extended display of amusement. "Owen's not wrong about the punching," he said. "Owen is 4 years old and cannot be our primary strategist," she said. "He's got the right instincts," he said. "He just needs better tactics." She smiled at that, and he saw her smiling, and there was a moment where neither of them said anything, and the kitchen was warm from the stove, and it was the kind of moment she'd learned not to look at too directly. The filing happened on a Tuesday in mid-June, as planned. Agnes Burr notarized the documents herself, which was technically within her authority, and practically an act of quiet solidarity that Evelyn noted and did not mention, because Agnes was not the kind of woman who appreciated being thanked for things she considered simply correct. 13 property deeds, 13 signatures, 1 joint water rights claim on the Callaway Creek drainage for the Eastern Valley. When it was done, Agnes stamped the copy and handed it back across the counter, and said, with the flat precision that was her characteristic register, "He'll know by end of week." "I know," Evelyn said. "He won't like it." "No." "You should be careful," Agnes said. "Not in a frightened way, just careful." "I'm always careful," Evelyn said. Agnes looked at her for a moment with something in her expression that was close to affection, in the particular form that practical women expressed it, which didn't look like most people's idea of affection at all. "I know you are," she said. "That's why I'm not more worried." Silas was waiting outside with the wagon. He took the stamped copy of the filing from her and looked at it, then looked at her. "It's done," she said. He nodded. He folded the document and put it inside his coat, the same motion she'd seen him make with the Callaway papers, the night of the flood, and picked up the reins. "Cora's keeping the boys until 6, he said. "I know." "You want to get something to eat before we head back?" She looked at him. This was not a thing he had previously suggested. Not once in the 8 months she'd been here had Silas Boone proposed doing anything that was not directly required for the operation of the ranch or the welfare of the boys. She understood that it was the filing, that it was relief or something related to it, but she also understood that it was something else, something that had been accumulating since November and had not found its form until just now. "Yes," she said. "All right." They ate at the small restaurant on the main street of Briar, which served 3 things and served all 3 of them competently. They talked about the coalition and the filing and what Harding's likely next move was, and then they ran out of that subject and talked about other things, about Owen's recent and passionate conviction that he wanted to raise chickens specifically, not the chickens they already had, but additional and distinct chickens that would be his personal chickens, about a letter Silas had received from his brother in Oregon that he hadn't answered yet and wasn't sure how to, about the fact that Evelyn had not written to Mrs. Alderson in Ohio in longer than she should have and was composing the letter in her head in pieces. It was ordinary conversation, the kind that happened between people who had moved past the point of performing ease into something that was actually easy. She didn't notice it becoming easy. It had just become easy, somewhere in the past 8 months, the way things did when you weren't watching for the transition. On the way home, the road running gold in the late afternoon light, Wyatt and Owen asleep in the back of the wagon against each other the way they always slept, she asked him the question she'd been carrying for a while. "What was she like?" she said. "Clara." He didn't stiffen, which she'd half expected. He was quiet for a moment, watching the road. "She was stubborn," he said. "More than me, which is something." A pause. "She had opinions about everything, strong ones. She wasn't wrong very often, which I found irritating at the time." Another pause, shorter. "She would have liked you." Evelyn looked at the road ahead. "How do you know?" "Because she had no patience for people who needed other people to tell them what they were worth," he said. "And you don't need that." He paused once more. "She would have said so in about 30 seconds of meeting you, and then asked you something impertinent." Something ached quietly in the back of her throat. "She sounds like someone worth missing," she said. "She is," he said, straightforward, without self-pity. "She is." They drove the rest of the way in a quiet that was not uncomfortable, the kind of quiet that had enough room in it for what had just been said. Harding's response came faster than she'd expected, and it came in a form she hadn't fully anticipated. She'd expected another economic maneuver, a call to Caldwell, pressure on someone else's debt, another nighttime visit to a coalition member designed to introduce doubt. What she got instead, on a Thursday afternoon in late June, was 2 men she didn't recognize riding onto the property while Silas was in the far pasture and she was alone with the boys in the yard. They weren't threatening exactly, in the obvious physical sense. They were polite, in the particular way that made politeness feel like a demonstration of what they were choosing not to do. The one who spoke did so from horseback, which she noticed. He didn't get down, which meant he hadn't come to talk. "Mr. Harding wants you to know," he said, "that the filing is going to be contested. He has documentation predating the current claims on the primary channel." "Mr. Harding is welcome to contest it in county court," she said. She was standing in the yard with Owen against her left leg and Wyatt against her right, because they'd been beside her when the men rode up, and she'd put her hands on their shoulders and kept them there. "That's what county court is for." The man looked at her with an expression that was estimating something. "He also wants you to know that he considers this situation personal, between you and him." "Then he should address me personally," she said, "not send messengers." A pause. He thought that might not be welcome. He was right, she said. It wouldn't be, but it would be direct, which this isn't. The man looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at the boys briefly and back at her. She understood the look. She was meant to understand it. That was the point of it. And she held very still and kept her hands on the boy's shoulders and looked back at him without expression. "He'll be in touch," the man said. "I'll be here," she said. They rode out. She watched them until they were gone. Then she crouched down between Owen and Wyatt and looked at both their faces, checking, not for injury, obviously, but for the particular look of frightened children who needed to be managed carefully, because she'd seen it before and knew it required a specific kind of response. Owen looked more angry than scared. Wyatt looked more confused than either. "Who were those men?" Wyatt said. "Messengers," she said, "for someone who doesn't like that we filed some papers." "What kind of papers?" Owen said. "The kind that protect what's ours," she said. Owen thought about this. Then he said, with the directness of a 4-year-old who had recently appointed himself an authority on the subject, "Papa should definitely punch him." "I'll let your papa know that's still on the table," she said, and stood up. She sent Owen and Wyatt inside to wash their hands before supper, and stood in the yard alone for a moment. The day was clear and bright, and the grass on the north pasture was that impossible green it had been all month, and she looked at it and thought about the word personal, and what Harding had meant by it, and what she was prepared to do about it. She thought about November, about a locked gate and a letter with no signature, about standing in a road in the cold with $11 and nowhere to go. She thought about the life she'd built since then, in increments she hadn't planned, out of materials she hadn't expected. The boys inside washing their hands. The kitchen that smelled like the bread she'd put on to rise that morning. The petition with 13 signatures, filed and stamped and sitting in the county records. She thought, he made this personal in November. He's just now noticing. When Silas came in from the pasture an hour later, she told him about the men, calmly and completely, without leaving anything out. He listened the same way he always listened to things that mattered. Still, attentive, his face doing the calculation she'd learned to recognize. When she finished, he said, he's escalating because the filing worked. That's what this is. He's running out of moves. I know, she said. Are you scared? She considered the question honestly. A little, she said. Not enough to stop. He looked at her for a long moment, and what moved through his expression then was something she didn't try to name, something that arrived and departed before she could catch it clearly. Okay, he said. Then we don't stop. She nodded. She turned back to the stove. Behind her, she heard him cross the kitchen and stop at the door to call the boys for supper, his voice doing that thing it always did when he called their names, going softer without going quieter. And she listened to the sound of them coming thundering down the hall in their boots, and she thought that a man who spoke to his children that way was not a man who was going to let fear be the last word on anything. She ladled the soup into bowls and called it supper, and they all sat down together, and outside the valley was green and gold in the long summer light, and whatever was coming would come, and they would be ready for it. The soup got cold that night before anyone noticed. That happened sometimes now. They'd sit at the table after supper and keep talking, and the boys would fall asleep in their chairs before anyone had thought to move them toward bed, and Evelyn would look up at some point and realize an hour had passed in what felt like 20 minutes. It was the kind of thing she'd read about in other people's lives and not fully believed. The ordinary accumulation of an evening, time moving differently when it was shared. She thought about that, washing the bowls after Silas carried both boys to bed. Owen over one shoulder, Wyatt over the other, both of them boneless with sleep. She thought about how 9 months ago she hadn't known this kitchen existed, how the version of her that had stood at Harding's gate in November would not have recognized this evening as something that could belong to her. She was still thinking about it when Silas came back downstairs and said, from the doorway, I need to tell you something. The way he said it made her set down the bowl she was drying. She turned around. He was standing in the kitchen doorway with his hands in his pockets and an expression she'd seen only once before. The night he'd told her about losing the calf in February, about the one born first in the year. The expression of a man who had been carrying something long enough that carrying it had become its own kind of damage. Sit down, she said. He sat. She sat across from him. The lamp was low and the kitchen had the particular closeness it got late at night, the warmth of the stove still radiating, the window dark behind him. When Clara died, he said, I decided something. I didn't decide it out loud. I didn't decide it in a way I could have explained to anyone at the time, but I decided it. He stopped, looked at the table. I decided I wasn't going to be the kind of fool who got hurt like that twice. Evelyn didn't say anything. It's a stupid thing to decide, he said. I know that now. I think I knew it then, which is probably why I didn't say it out loud. He looked up. But I believed it. For a whole year I believed it. And then you showed up in the road dragging a trunk, and I made you a business offer because it was practical, and I needed help. And I told myself that was all it was. She held very still. I've been telling myself that for 9 months, he said. I'm not sure I'm capable of continuing to tell myself that. I'm also not sure. He stopped again, started over. I'm not a man who knows how to do this gracefully. Clara would tell you that. She spent the first 6 months of our courtship wanting to shake me because I couldn't say anything directly about anything that mattered. A pause. So I'm going to try to say this directly. Okay, she said. I don't want you to leave, he said. Not because I need the help with the boys, not because the house would go back to being a wreck, because, he exhaled, Because this is the first time in 14 months I've come in from the barn and felt like I was coming home to something instead of just coming in from the barn. The lamp made a small sound. Outside, something moved across the roof. A branch. The wind. I know that's not a declaration, he said. I know it's not what you'd read in a book, but it's what's true, and I thought you deserved to have the true version instead of me continuing to pretend I didn't feel it. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what she wanted to say and what was accurate and whether those were the same thing, which they sometimes were and sometimes weren't. I came here with nothing, she said finally. You know that. I came here because there was nowhere else to go, and I stayed because it made practical sense, and I told myself the same story you were telling yourself, that it was work, that it was temporary, that I was good at not needing things. He was listening the way he listened to things that mattered. I'm not as good at it as I thought, she said. As it turns out, he looked at her with an expression that was so unguarded, so entirely without the careful management he usually maintained on his own face, that she felt the particular vertigo of seeing someone clearly at close range. I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight, he said. I want to be clear about that. This isn't pressure. I know you stayed because you didn't have choices, and I've thought about that a lot, about whether you'd still be here if you'd had them. And I hope, he stopped. I think you would, but I want you to have the choice, actually have it, before anything else. So, he reached into his coat, the one hanging on the chair beside him, the one she'd mended the left cuff on in February without being asked, and took out an envelope and set it on the table in front of her. She looked at it. That's 8 months of wages at $3 a week, he said. I've been banking it since you arrived instead of paying it weekly, like I said I would, which I should apologize for, but I wanted it to be enough that it was actually a choice. There's a little more than that. I added some. There's enough there to get you back to Ohio or wherever else you'd want to go, and to have something when you arrived. She looked at the envelope. She didn't pick it up. You're paying me to leave? She said. I'm making sure you can leave, he said, so that if you stay, it's not because you're trapped here. She looked up at him. Silas, she said, I know it's strange. You don't have to. It's not strange, she said. It's the most careful thing anyone has ever done for me. She paused. That's what's difficult about it. He was quiet. She looked at the envelope and thought about Ohio, about Mrs. Alderson's spare room, about the cold that got into the walls. She thought about what returning would look like, what the future there contained, what it would add up to. She thought about the woman who had stood at the gate in November, stripped of options, and the woman sitting at this table now, who was something else, something that had been built here, in this house, with these people. She thought about Owen saying Papa should punch him, and Wyatt standing in the kitchen saying, I think about his mother's voice. She thought about a muddy hill in March, and the particular quality of walking through something difficult alongside a person who didn't require explanation. I don't want to go to Ohio, she said. He held very still. I'm not staying because of the money or because I don't have options, she said. I want to be clear about that. I'm staying because... She stopped and for a moment couldn't find the right language, which happened to her rarely and annoyed her. Because leaving would be leaving something real, and I've spent most of my life not having anything real to leave. I don't want to practice that again. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight and warmth to it. Okay, he said. His voice was slightly different, not softer, just with something more in it. Okay, she said. He didn't reach across the table, and neither did she, because they were both, fundamentally, people who moved carefully with things that mattered. But something had shifted in the kitchen, in the quality of the air between them, and they both knew it, and that was enough for tonight. She picked up the envelope. I'm keeping this, she said. Not to leave, just to have. That's exactly what it's for, he said. Mata. She thought it would feel different afterward. She thought there would be some obvious transition, a morning that looked different, a shift in how they occupied the same space. What happened instead was subtler and more disorienting than that. Everything was largely the same, except that the subtext had changed, and the changed subtext made the ordinary moments mean something different. He handed her a cup of coffee in the morning, and it meant something different. She passed him the bread at supper, and it meant something different. She overheard him telling Owen with considerable patience that the personal chickens he intended to acquire would need to live with the existing chickens and not in the house. And the fact that it made her laugh, genuinely, from somewhere uncalculated, meant something different. She was aware of being happy in a way that was slightly alarming because she didn't fully trust it, and she didn't know what to do with it, and it sat in her chest like something fragile that she was carrying through uncertain terrain. She mentioned this to Cora Petty on a Saturday in early July, which was perhaps not the wisest audience for vulnerability, but Cora was the person she'd come to trust with the things she couldn't quite sort out alone. Cora listened to the whole thing with her coffee cup and her expression of a woman who had heard everything and was rarely surprised by any of it. "You're waiting for something to go wrong," Cora said. "I'm not waiting for it," Evelyn said. "I'm aware it might." "Same thing," Cora said. "You've spent a long time expecting the floor to drop. Now there's a solid floor, and you're still walking like it isn't." She drank her coffee. "That doesn't go away quickly. You just have to keep walking until your feet believe it." "That's either wise or useless," Evelyn said. "Usually both," Cora said serenely. What actually helped, and she recognized this as ironic given the circumstances, was Harding. Harding's contest of the water rights filing moved forward through July, and the movement of it required her attention in a way that was practical and urgent, and left less room for the kind of circular self-examination that happiness seemed to generate in her. She was in correspondence with Agnes Burr twice a week. She organized 2 coalition meetings at the Lundqvist place, where 13 ranching families sat in a barn and talked through their unified response to the contest. And she ran those meetings because no one else seemed inclined to, and she ran them the way she did everything. Directly, without performance, with a strong preference for getting to the point. She was not a natural public speaker. She knew this. She was better in small rooms than large ones, better one-on-one than with a crowd. But the coalition wasn't really a crowd. It was a collection of individuals she'd sat with one at a time and listened to, and they responded to her the way people responded to someone who had actually heard them. When she spoke in those meetings, they listened, and she suspected it was partly because they could tell she'd done her homework, and partly because they could tell she wasn't performing anything. Silas watched her run those meetings from his seat along the wall, and she could feel him watching, and she did not let it make her self-conscious, which was a thing she was proud of. After the second meeting, walking back across the dark field to the wagon, while the Lundqvist barn lit up gold behind them, he said, "You know what you're doing in there." "More or less," she said. "More," he said. "Definitely more." She didn't answer that, but she carried it. But Harding's legal contest was managed by a lawyer named Collier, who came down from the county seat and was clearly better than anything the valley had retained before, which told her something about how much this mattered to Harding. Collier was efficient and formal, and produced 3 pieces of documentation purporting to show prior water rights claims predating the coalition's filing, and Agnes Burr sent her copies of all 3 within a day of their submission, with a note in Agnes's precise handwriting that said, "The third one is interesting. Look at the surveyor's stamp date." She looked at the surveyor's stamp date. The survey cited in the third document was dated 18 months before the survey company referenced had been established in the county. She stared at that for a long time. Then she wrote a letter to the county surveyor's office. The reply came back in 8 days. The county surveyor's office had no record of any survey on the Callaway Creek drainage in the year indicated. The company name on the stamp had not been licensed in this county until the following year. The document appeared to reference a survey that did not exist. She read the letter 3 times, then once more for certainty. Then she put on her coat and drove herself to Agnes Burr's office. Agnes read the letter from the surveyor's office without expression. Then she set it on her desk and was quiet for a moment. "That's a forged document," Agnes said. "Submitted to county court." "That is what it appears to be," Evelyn said. "That is a serious problem for the person who submitted it," Agnes said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "I thought so too." Agnes looked at her with that expression she sometimes had, the close, assessing one. "You found this on your own. You told me to look at the stamp date." I said it was interesting. I didn't tell you what to look for. I know how to look, Evelyn said. Agnes was quiet for another moment. Then she picked up a fresh sheet of paper and began writing. You'll need to submit this to the court with the surveyor's letter attached, she said. I'll draft the accompanying statement. You'll want Collier to receive a copy before the hearing so he can't claim he was unaware. She paused. Are you prepared for what happens to Harding if this is sustained? Tell me what happens, Evelyn said. Submitting a forged document in a property rights proceeding is a criminal matter, Agnes said, not a civil one. That moves it entirely outside the water rights case. He'd be facing charges, not just a lost claim. Evelyn sat with that for a moment. She thought about November, about the locked gate and the 4 sentences, about the night she'd lain awake calculating what he was bluffing about and what he wasn't, and whether the floor was going to drop. File it, she said. Agnes filed it. She did not tell Silas immediately, and that was a mistake, and she knew it was a mistake while she was making it. She needed to sit with it for a day, to hold the shape of what she'd found and what it meant, and let it settle from urgent fact into something she could present calmly. She was aware that this was still the old habit, the one she'd mostly broken, and she let herself have one day with it before she told him everything on a Wednesday evening while the boys were in the yard chasing a frog Owen had located with considerable excitement. He listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a longer moment than usual. A forged survey document, he said. Confirmed by the county surveyor's office, she said. He looked out the window at the boys in the yard. Owen had the frog. Wyatt was making an argument for his turn with it that involved considerable physical emphasis. That's not a man making a hard play in a land dispute, Silas said. That's a man who was planning this long enough to fabricate documentation. Yes, she said. I've been thinking about what else he may have fabricated. The Lundqvist debt, he said immediately. That's my first question, she said. If he forged a survey, a debt letter from a dead man is simple by comparison. Silas was quiet. She watched his face do the thing it did when he was pushing past the immediate reaction into the harder thinking, the thing she had come to recognize as one of his better qualities, the ability to move through anger into useful calculation without getting stuck in between. Agnes is filing the challenge, he said. Already submitted, she said. Collier was notified yesterday. How long until the hearing? 3 weeks. He nodded, looked at his hands. Then he looked at her with an expression that was not simple and not uncomplicated, but was clear. I want you to know something, he said. She waited. This, what you've done, the coalition, the filing, the documents, I want to be clear that this isn't what I hired you for, and it isn't something I could have done on my own, and it isn't something He stopped, tried again. I've been taking it for granted. I don't mean to take it for granted. I want you to know I see it. She looked at him. You're not taking it for granted. I don't tell you enough that I see it. You show me, she said. It's not the same as telling, but it's not nothing. He met her eyes. It should be both, he said. She thought, this is what it looks like when someone is genuinely trying to be better than their habits. She thought Clara was right to keep waiting for him. 3 weeks, she said, going back to the practical, because they were both more comfortable there and there was real work to do. We should prepare a full accounting of the coalition's claims in case Collier tries to redirect the hearing onto the original filing and away from the forgery. I'll talk to Thomas Beaumont about being present, he said. He's the largest stakeholder after us. His being there matters. Cora, too, she said. Judges pay attention to 73-year-old women. I don't know why, but they do. Cora pays attention to judges, Silas said. That's probably why. It was the most deadpan thing he'd said in her presence in 10 months, and she laughed, genuinely again, from the same uncalculated place. And he looked at her laughing with an expression she finally had a name for, even if she wasn't ready to say it out loud. The night before the hearing, she couldn't sleep. She lay in her room listening to the house settle and thought about all the ways it could go wrong. Collier was good. She knew he was good. He would find an argument for why the survey discrepancy was irrelevant or procedural or the result of record-keeping error, and it would be a persuasive argument because persuasive arguments were what she was paying him for. And the judge might be sympathetic to Harding for reasons that had nothing to do with the merits of the case, and any of a dozen things she couldn't control might tip the outcome in the wrong direction. She was still awake at midnight when she heard the floorboard in the hallway. The third one from the top of the stairs, the one she'd been meaning to fix for 2 months. She heard it and then heard nothing for a moment, and then a knock on her door, very light. She said, "Come in." It was Wyatt. He was in his nightclothes, holding the edge of the door frame the way he had the very first day, and looking at her with an expression that in an adult would have been called worried, but in a 4-year-old looked more like he had been awake thinking and had reached a conclusion that required action. "Are you okay?" he said. "I'm fine," she said. "Why are you up?" "I heard you," he said. "You move around when you're not sleeping." She hadn't known that. She looked at him, this small person who had apparently been tracking her sleep patterns, and felt something turn over quietly in her chest. "I'm nervous about tomorrow," she said. "There's something important happening, and I want it to go well." He came into the room without being invited and sat on the end of her bed with the gravity of someone settling in for a real conversation. "Is it about the bad man?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Will Papa be there?" "Yes." "Then it'll be okay," he said, with the simple authority of someone for whom this was obvious. "Papa makes things okay." "He does," she said. "And other people help him." Wyatt thought about this. "You help him," he said. "I try to." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the window. "Owen and me," he said. "We call you Mama. Not out loud, just—" He stopped, looked at her. "Just in our heads. Is that okay?" She was very still. "That's more than okay," she said when she could manage it. He nodded, satisfied, as though this had been the actual point of the visit and everything else was secondary. He slid off the bed. "You should sleep," he said, in the tone of a child who had heard this instruction enough times to have absorbed it as wisdom. "Tomorrow will be better when you're not tired." "You're right," she said. He went to the door and then turned back. "Miss Evelyn?" "Yes." "We don't say it out loud because we weren't sure you'd want us to," he said. "Owen thought maybe it would make you sad." She looked at him across the dark room. "Tell Owen it doesn't make me sad," she said. "Tell him the opposite." Wyatt nodded, once, with the resolution of a small person who had completed his mission and was prepared to go back to bed. After he left, she lay in the dark for a long while. She was not thinking about the hearing. She was not thinking about Collier, or the forged survey, or what the judge would decide. She was thinking about just in our heads, and the particular bravery of a 4-year-old who had come down the hall in the dark to ask permission for something his heart had already been doing for months. She slept eventually, better than she'd expected. The hearing was in this county courthouse in Briar, in a room that smelled like wood polish and old paper, with the kind of high windows that let in light without warmth. She sat at the coalition's table with Silas on her left and Thomas Beaumont on his left, and Cora Petty directly behind them in the gallery, upright and attentive, in the way of a woman who had made judges nervous since approximately 1851. Harding was there. Of course he was there. She hadn't seen him since the morning of her arrival, not clearly, not up close. He was older than she'd expected, or had aged harder, with the kind of face that would have looked authoritative on a man who hadn't spent the past 9 months doing what he'd been doing. He didn't look at her directly. She noticed that. He looked at Silas, at Beaumont, at the judge, at Collier. He looked everywhere except at the woman who had undone him. She thought, "You didn't look at the letter you left either. You didn't sign your name." She thought, "You've always known, on some level, that you weren't going to be able to look." Collier made his argument. It was, as she'd predicted, good. A procedural argument about the admissibility of the surveyor's letter, a claim that the discrepancy was a record-keeping error on the county's part rather than fraudulent intent on the document's part. He was smooth and informed, and she could see the judge following him with the careful attention of someone who was genuinely undecided. Then Agnes stood up. Agnes Burr, county clerk, who had no formal role in the proceeding and had not been asked to speak, stood up from her seat in the gallery, and said, in her particular register of absolute precision, "Your Honor, if I may." The judge looked at her. "You're the county clerk." "I am," Agnes said. "And the original survey registration records for this county are my responsibility. I'd like to enter the full records for the relevant dates into evidence, if the court will accept them." Collier objected. The judge overruled him. Agnes's records went into evidence, which meant the complete absence of any registered survey on the Callaway Creek drainage in the year on the disputed document was now part of the official record, and Collier could not make it not part of the record, and the judge could see it. Evelyn watched the judge read the records. She watched the particular quality of attention with which he read them. She watched him set them down and look at Harding, and then at Collier, with an expression that she'd seen before, not on a judge's face, but on Cora's, on Mrs. Lundqvist's, on the face of anyone who had been trying to give the benefit of the doubt and had just run out of reason to keep doing it. It didn't end that day. These things didn't end in a single hearing. The judge ordered a 2-week continuance and a formal inquiry into the document's origins, and Collier and Harding left without looking at the coalition table, and the coalition members filed out of the courtroom in various states of cautious relief and residual anxiety. But on the courthouse steps, in the July heat, Cora Petty turned to Evelyn and said, without preamble, "He's finished." "We don't know that yet," Evelyn said. "I know it," Cora said. "I have been watching judges read documents since before your mother was born. That man is finished." She said it with the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting 11 years and had finally seen the thing she was waiting for begin to arrive. Silas, standing beside Evelyn, said nothing, but his hand found the back of her arm, briefly. Not a gesture, not a declaration, just contact, just the specific weight of his hand saying, "I know, and I'm here." And then he dropped it and walked down the steps to where Beaumont was standing. She stood on the courthouse steps in the July sun and looked out at the street, at Briar going about its ordinary Thursday, and felt the shape of the past 9 months in the specific way you felt something when it was about to become a different kind of thing. Not over, not resolved, but turned. She thought about Wyatt's voice in her dark room, just in our heads. She thought about an envelope she hadn't opened, sitting in the drawer of her nightstand, that she would probably never spend, that she would probably keep for the rest of her life as the evidence of what it meant when someone made sure you had a choice. She thought, "I am so far from that gate." She thought, "I am exactly where I'm supposed to be." She went down the steps to where Silas was waiting, and they walked together to the wagon, and the summer stretched out ahead of them, long and full of work and unfinished business. And she thought that was fine. That was more than fine, because the unfinished business was theirs, and the work was theirs, and the valley was theirs, and she was not doing any of it alone. The 2-week continuance felt longer than 2 weeks. That was the thing about waiting when the thing you were waiting for mattered. It expanded to fill whatever space it was given and then kept expanding. Evelyn kept herself occupied with the ordinary work of the ranch and the coalition correspondence and the boys, who had entered a phase of intense interest in building structures out of whatever materials they could locate, which meant she spent a portion of each day rescuing kitchen implements from architectural projects and negotiating the return of her wooden spoon. She wrote to Mrs. Alderson in Ohio. A long letter, the one she'd been composing in pieces since January. She told the whole of it: the gate, the letter, Silas, the boys, the water rights, the forged document. She wrote it over 3 evenings at the kitchen table and read it back and thought, "This is not the life I thought I was going to have." She thought it without grief. That was the thing that surprised her most. The complete absence of grief for the life she'd expected. The one that had been waiting at a gate that was locked. Mrs. Alderson wrote back in 12 days, which was fast for the post. And her letter said, "Evelyn Harper, I always knew Ohio was too small for you. I just didn't know what wasn't." She kept that letter in the drawer with the envelope. The formal inquiry into the survey document took 11 days. The investigator sent by the district court was a man named Pruitt, methodical and unimpressed by anyone, who spent 3 days at the county records office and 2 days interviewing people and produced a report that Agnes Burr obtained a copy of through means she did not fully explain, but which Evelyn suspected involved the clerk's network of professional relationships that extended across 3 counties. The report was 8 pages. The conclusion was on page 7, and it was not ambiguous. The survey referenced in Harding's submitted documentation had been fabricated. The stamp was forged. The surveyor's name on the document was a man who had died 2 years before the survey's stated date. The paper stock, examined by a document examiner in the county seat, was consistent with paper produced 4 years after the date it purported to bear. Evelyn read page 7 twice. Then she set the report down on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long moment. Silas came in from the barn and saw her face and said, "What happened?" She turned the report around and pushed it across the table. He read page 7. He read it again. He set it down. "He forged a dead man's name," he said. "Yes." "On a document submitted to county court." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was deciding how to feel about something before he let himself feel it. "How long have you known something like this was possible? That he might have fabricated documentation?" "Since March," she said. "When I found out about the Lundqvist debt. The pattern was there. I just didn't have the specific evidence until Agnes pointed me at the stamp date." He looked at her. He looked at, not with the complicated expression she sometimes couldn't read, with something simpler and more direct than that. "You've been carrying this since March," he said. "I was carrying a suspicion since March," she said. "Not a fact." "That's still something to carry." "I know." She met his eyes. "I'm telling you now." "I know you are." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "What happens next?" "Pruitt's report goes to the district court judge. The water rights contest gets dismissed. There's no case left without the fabricated document. The forgery charge moves to the county prosecutor." She paused. "Harding's lawyer will try to argue it was a clerical error, that someone else provided the document to Collier without his client's knowledge. It won't work, but it'll take time." "How much time?" "Agnes thinks the prosecutor will move quickly. This is the kind of case that makes a prosecutor's reputation." She looked at the report. "He'll be charged by end of summer. Trial sometime this fall, most likely." Silas was quiet for a moment, then, "And the water rights." "The coalition's joint claim stands unopposed," she said. "The Callaway Creek drainage rights are registered to the 13 properties. Harding can't divert the channel without violating the claim, and he'd be doing it while under criminal indictment, which would be considerable stupidity even for him." Silas looked out the window. "It's over then," he said. "The part we've been fighting." "That part," she said. "Yes." He looked back at her, and something in his face settled. Not relief exactly, because relief implied the tension had been visible, and he'd been carrying his without showing much of it. Something more like the expression of a man setting down a weight he'd gotten so used to that he'd stopped noticing it until the moment it was gone. "I want to show you something," he said. "That." He took her to the east field in the late afternoon, which was not somewhere she went often. It was pasture land, his domain rather than hers, the part of the ranch she'd come to think of as his private geography. The summer grass was deep, and the creek was running clear and low after the spring violence of it, and the light was doing what Montana light did in July, which was fall at an angle that made everything look like it was made of something more valuable than it actually was. He stopped at the fence line where the Callaway Creek property began and pointed across it. "That's the Callaway parcel," he said, "the one we held the mortgage on." She knew it. She could see the foundation of the rebuilt house from here, the frame going up, Daniel and Margaret Callaway, and the Beaumont brothers working on it through June. "I want to expand the coalition," he said, "not just for water rights, for grazing, for equipment, for the school." He paused. "There's no school in this valley. The nearest one is 14 miles south. Owen and Wyatt are going to need one in 2 years." "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about the school." "I thought you might have been." He looked at the creek. "I want to deed a portion of the east field to the coalition as common land, a building site. If enough families contribute labor and material, we could have a structure by next spring." She looked at him. That's a significant piece of land. It's the right piece, he said. The creek runs the west edge of it. It's central to the valley. It's where it should be. He paused. I should have done it 2 years ago. I didn't because I was keeping to myself, keeping everything to myself. You were grieving, she said. That's part of it, he said. Part of it was also that I'd convinced myself the smaller I kept things, the less there was to lose. He looked at her directly. That's not a way to live. I know that now. I think I knew it before you arrived, and I just didn't want to admit it. She stood beside him at the fence line and looked at the field and the creek and the frame of the Calloway house rising against the July sky, and thought about the specific shape of what he'd just said. Not an apology, not a declaration, but a man accounting honestly for his own history and what he was prepared to do differently. That was rarer, in her experience, than most of what passed for honesty. The school will need a teacher, she said. Yes. I could do it, she said, temporarily, until someone trained comes. I taught 2 winters in Ohio. I know the basics. He looked at her with the corner of his mouth doing the thing it did. You taught 2 winters in Ohio, he said. You also organized 13 ranching families, identified a forged legal document, and delivered a calf in a freezing barn at 2 a.m. The calf was easier than the ranching families, she said. I believe that, he said. They stood there for a moment in the long light, and then he said, without preamble and without the careful setup he'd used in November, I'd like to marry you. She looked at him. Not because it's practical, he said. Not because it's practical. February and I have been figuring out how to say it since March, and I've apparently decided that a fence line in July is the right location. It's not a bad location, she said. The light's good, he agreed. She looked at the creek. She looked at the field. She looked at him, this man who had met her on a road with nowhere to go and offered her the one thing that mattered, the freedom to leave, and had been offering it in different forms ever since, and had never once asked her to be smaller or more grateful or less than what she was. She thought about what she'd told him in the kitchen in November. I'm not used to having someone to tell. She thought about how long ago that felt. She thought about what the version of her that had stood at the gate would have said if someone had described this moment to her. This field, this man, this question. She thought, she wouldn't have believed it. She thought, that's not her problem anymore. Yes, she said, I'd like that. He didn't say anything immediately. She suspected he'd been prepared for more negotiation, more qualification. She'd given him neither because she was done with both, and she thought he deserved the clean version. He reached over and took her hand, and that was enough. And they stood at the fence line while the light moved across the field and the creek ran its unhurried course. And somewhere behind them, she knew, 2 small boys were conducting whatever mayhem the afternoon had given them access to. We should probably go back, she said eventually. Probably, he said. Neither of them moved for another few minutes. Tuck. They were married in September in Cora Petty's front yard because Cora had declared it would happen there and no one had the energy to argue with her, and because her yard was the largest and most central and had a view of the north pasture that Cora described as the best advertisement for staying in this valley that exists. The justice of the peace was a man named Fowler who had known Silas for 12 years and told Evelyn, before the ceremony, that she was either very brave or very patient, and she told him she wasn't sure there was a difference. 13 ranching families came. Agnes Burr came, in a dress that suggested she'd owned it for 20 years and cared for it meticulously, and stood in the back row with her hands folded and her characteristic expression of someone who considered the proceedings satisfactory. Daniel and Margaret Calloway came, their house still not fully finished but standing, their children wearing shoes that Margaret had clearly spent considerable effort locating. The Lundqvists brought all 6 of their children, and Eric shook Silas's hand for a long time and didn't say much, which was how he expressed most things that mattered. Owen and Wyatt stood beside Evelyn during the ceremony, one on each side, in shirts she'd sewn herself from the blue flannel she'd found at Caldwell's. Caldwell, who had come around in the spring when it became clear which way the valley was moving, and who had extended the account without comment, and apparently decided that certain business decisions benefited from revisiting. The boys held still for approximately 4 minutes, which was about 3 minutes longer than she'd expected, and she counted it as a success. Wyatt, at one point during the justice's words, reached up and took her hand. She held his hand for the rest of the ceremony. Afterward, Cora stood beside her with a cup of something warm and said, "You look like someone who just figured out what they were building toward." "Is it that obvious?" Evelyn said. "To me," Cora said, "everyone else just sees a wedding." She paused. "How does it feel?" Evelyn considered the question honestly, because Cora deserved honesty, and because she was trying to get better at giving it, even when it was imprecise. "Like the first solid thing in a long time," she said. Cora nodded. "That's the right answer," she said, and went to find more of whatever was in her cup. Harding was charged in October. The prosecutor moved quickly, as Agnes had predicted. This was, as Agnes had also predicted, exactly the kind of case that made a prosecutor's reputation in a county where property rights were the foundation of everything. Collier withdrew from representation. Harding retained a lawyer from the Capitol, which cost him considerably more than Collier had, and the new lawyer was skilled enough to extend the proceedings, but not skilled enough to change their direction. The trial was in November, exactly 1 year after Evelyn had arrived at the gate. She did not attend. She was aware she could have, and she was aware that some people expected her to. Cora had suggested it twice, in the way she suggested things when she thought they were important, which was to say directly and without softening. But she thought about it carefully and decided that she did not need to watch his accounting to have already received what justice meant for her. She'd been at the courthouse in July. She'd seen the judge's face reading the records Agnes submitted. She knew the shape of how it ended. She didn't need to be in the room. What she needed was to not build her ongoing life around a man who had tried to make her a footnote in his. Agnes sent her a letter the day the verdict came in. It said, "Guilty on 2 counts, document fraud and obstruction of property rights proceedings. Sentenced to 18 months and a fine in excess of the Callaway land's full market value, which the court has ordered directed to the Coalition's Common Land Fund. I thought you'd want to know. A B." She read it at the kitchen table and set it down and was quiet for a moment. Silas looked up from the harness he was mending. "Agnes?" he said. "Guilty," she said. He nodded. "Put down the harness. How do you feel?" She thought about it. "Finished," she said. "Not glad exactly, just finished." "That's the right thing to feel," he said. "Is it?" "Better than glad," he said. "Glad would mean you'd been waiting for it. Finished means you'd already moved on, and this is just the paperwork catching up." She looked at him across the table. She thought, "You understand things, and you're not always quick to say so, but you understand them." "The fine goes to the Common Land Fund," she said. "That means we can break ground on the school in spring." He picked the harness back up. "I'll talk to Beaumont about timber," he said, and that was that. And the trial was over, and they went back to the work of the life they were building. The school went up the following April, on the piece of Eastfield Silas had deeded to the Coalition in September. It was not a large building, 1 room, 6 windows, a stove that the Beaumont brothers installed with the quiet competence they brought to anything physical. But it was solid, built of good timber, and the labor of 11 families who showed up over 3 weekends with tools and lunch and children underfoot, which slowed things down and also, Evelyn thought, made it exactly what it was supposed to be. She taught the first year herself, as she'd said she would. 14 children, ages 5 through 12, in the same room, which required the kind of organizational creativity that she discovered she was considerably better at than she'd expected. She was not a natural teacher in the sense of warmth and patience flowing without effort. She had to work at the patience some days, especially with the older boys who had decided that school was for younger people and were present only under parental duress. But she was good at explaining things in ways that made them make sense, and she was fair in the specific way that children recognized and responded to. And by December she had the older boys engaged against their own intentions. Owen and Wyatt were, predictably, the students she found most challenging because they were her children, and children were always more difficult for their own parents, which she'd known intellectually and now understood completely. Wyatt was attentive and serious and asked questions that were usually better than the ones she'd prepared for. Owen was quick and distracted and drove her to the edge of her patience approximately twice a week, and then said something so unexpectedly perceptive that she had to look out the window for a moment to compose herself. She wrote about it to Mrs. Alderson, who had taken to writing back with increasing frequency since September. Mrs. Alderson had opinions about children and education, developed over 40 years of living next to a schoolhouse, and she offered them with the generous confidence of a woman who had nothing to lose by being wrong. Evelyn read the letters in the evenings and sometimes read pieces of them aloud to Silas, who listened and occasionally said something dry and precise that was much better than anything she'd offer in response. And it occurred to her one evening, Owen and Wyatt asleep, the lamp low, his voice in the warm kitchen, that she had built an ordinary life. Not a survival, not a provisional arrangement waiting to become something else. An ordinary life, the kind people built on purpose, with intention, out of materials that included grief and stubbornness and the willingness to be surprised by what was possible. She had not known she wanted this exactly. She'd wanted stability, safety, a door she could lock from the inside. She'd gotten those things and discovered they were the beginning, not the end. She thought about what she would tell the version of herself standing at the gate, if she could. She'd thought about this more than once in the past year. The woman with $11 and a cracked mirror and someone else's shortbread already gone. She'd wondered what she would say. What she landed on, finally, was not a reassurance and not a warning. It was something closer to, the floor you're standing on is not the last floor, that the thing being taken from you is not the same as the thing being denied you, that the locked gate is a locked gate, and it is not the whole world, and the road continues in both directions, and sometimes the thing you didn't plan for turns out to be the thing that fits. She couldn't have heard that then. She knew that. She'd had to live it to understand it. The way most things worth understanding had to be lived rather than told. But she thought about it, in the evenings, in the kitchen, and was grateful for the locked gate in the specific way you became grateful for the things that forced you off the road you thought you were on. The first snow of the second winter came in November, earlier than the year before, and Evelyn stood at the kitchen window watching it come down in the heavy, deliberate way of a first snowfall and felt the house around her. The warmth of the stove, the sound of the boys arguing about something in the back room, Silas's boots by the door, the harness he'd left on the table to finish mending. She heard the argument in the back room resolve itself without intervention, which she counted as growth. She was still at the window when she heard the sound of hoofbeats on the road. She didn't think much of it. People passed. And then she looked out and saw a woman on horseback moving slowly up the road toward their gate. And the woman was leading a horse that carried luggage. And she was moving with the particular quality of someone who was very tired and not entirely sure where they were going. Evelyn watched her for a moment. Then she went to get her coat. She was at the gate before the woman reached it. Up close she could see that she was young, younger than Evelyn had been at the gate, 22 or 23, with a traveling coat that had seen better days and an expression that Evelyn recognized immediately and completely, not because she'd read about it or been told about it, but because she'd worn it herself for approximately 45 minutes on a November road a little over 2 years ago. The woman looked at her with the controlled blankness of someone who was not going to cry in front of a stranger, no matter what. "I'm looking for," she started and stopped. "I had an arrangement. In this valley. It fell through." "I know how that goes," Evelyn said. The woman looked at her. Something in her face shifted, just slightly, just the beginning of something. "Is there a town nearby? A boarding house?" "There's a town," Evelyn said, 11 miles east." She paused. "But it's snowing, and you've been riding a while, and I've got soup on the stove." The woman looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone calculating whether to accept kindness from a stranger, doing the same math Evelyn had done at the roadside 2 Novembers ago, when a man on horseback had offered her something that didn't fit the category of anything she'd learned to trust. "I don't want to impose," the woman said. "You're not imposing," Evelyn said. "I'm inviting." Behind her she heard the front door open, and she knew without looking that it was the boys. They always heard when something happened at the gate, some early warning system built of curiosity and the particular alertness of children raised on a working ranch. She heard Owen say something to Wyatt in an undertone, and Wyatt reply, and then 2 sets of footsteps on the porch. "Who's that?" Owen called. "Someone who needs supper," Evelyn called back. "Go tell your father we have a guest." She turned back to the woman at the gate. "My name is Evelyn Boone," she said. "Come in out of the snow." The woman looked at the open gate, at the house behind it with the light in the windows and the 2 boys retreating back inside, at the woman standing in the first snow of winter with her coat open and an expression that was simply waiting, simply present, not requiring explanation. She dismounted. "Ruth," she said. "My name is Ruth." "Ruth," Evelyn said. "Welcome." She took the horse's lead and walked with Ruth up to the house, and she thought about all of it, the whole arc of it, from the letter with no signature to this moment, from the woman who had arrived with nowhere to go to the woman who could open a gate for someone else. She thought about what it meant that she could do this now. Not perform generosity, but simply have it. Have enough, be enough, to offer what she'd once desperately needed. She thought, that's the whole story, isn't it? Not the water rights or the forged document or even the wedding in Cora's front yard. The whole story was always this, that what is done to you does not have to be the definition of what you do. That a locked gate teaches you the value of an open one. That the people who abandon you in the road are giving you, without meaning to, the chance to discover who you are without them. She didn't say any of that to Ruth. Ruth needed soup and a warm room and someone to not ask too many questions tonight. The rest could wait. Silas met them at the door. He took Ruth's luggage from the horse without being asked, the same way he'd taken the Calloway documents in the rain, the same way he did everything that needed doing, quietly, without production, because it was the right thing, and that was enough reason. He looked at Evelyn over Ruth's head as they came inside. A brief look, private and complete, the kind of look that had a whole conversation in it. She looked back at him. Then they brought Ruth in out of the snow, and the door closed behind them, and the house held them all in its warmth while the winter came down over the valley, in the long, slow, generous way of a season that had nowhere to be and all the time in the world.
I think at the end of the day, it's like, just be a chill person, you know? Like, don't get me wrong, I do love a good competition from time to time because I do have a competitive spirit. I really do. I fucking love that shit. But in good fun, you know what I mean? Like in a good fucking fun type of thing. People who make eye contact during a handshake, oh yes. 100% same ocean. I agree. Yes, 100%. I'm with you there too. Now, if they're neurodivergent, I can understand if they don't. I can understand because I myself am ADHD. So I think that taken into that consideration. Right. Exactly. Exactly, Solon. You got me. So I'm still not used to it. Yeah, exactly. 100%. So it's like I myself, because I'm I guess low support needs, autistic, and I'm also an extrovert and I have ADHD. So it's like that combo, I think, lends itself to being more like I will make eye contact with people. I'm a recovering introvert. I can look at other people's shoes while talking. Oh, that's funny.